Welcome to Off Panel.
Yo everybody, welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the branding manager at Image Comics. It's David Brothers. Thanks for coming on, David.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, while we're going to get into your role at Image in a little bit, when I have a new guest on, I like to kind of talk a little bit about their background. And I want to start with your personal comic book origins. What were the comics that first started drawing your interest, and what was it about comics that appealed to you so much when you were younger?
I actually I'm pretty sure I still own my first comic. Hopefully, I moved since, but it was Amazing Spider-Man 316 and 317.
Yeah,
it's like the second Venom storyline. Todd McFarlane, David Michelini, and that was like what grabbed me. I got them from my uncle, he was old enough, like he was a high school guy when I was in elementary school, so he was like the coolest person on the planet. So like any comic he gave me was instantly the best comic in the world. And I kind of like learned to love to read probably from comics. There's just something about like the pictures and the words where it's almost like a novel with what I thought were all the boring parts cut out. I feel differently now, but comics kind of get right to the point. Like you don't say like, oh, he punched this person. You see the crazy Kirby punch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just going to say that like that's a really cool thing for a kid. It makes reading very easy.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, like I segued into, even more comics. I was like an X-Men kid. X-Men and Spider-Man were my two favorite things. And then like I eventually got into like novels once I got a library card in middle school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think comics have this like visceral level to them that really speaks to kids in a lot of ways. And it's kind of unexplainable. Like you're talking about like the curve of the punch. I remember the first comics that the first comics I really remember getting is my parents got me this like, you remember when we were younger and they had those like kind of lots, those like grab bag type things?
Yeah, like 5 for 5 or something like that.
Yeah. They had there was this one that was just like a big chunk of Transformers comics, like the old Marvel 80s ones. And I got one of those. And there was this comic that had all of the Decepticons and all of the Autobots fighting on the moon. And like if you went into the back, it would say who was who. And I was like, this is like my dream. It was unbelievable. Yeah. And I just remember that. And it was just like, I don't think I could experience anything like that in another medium, because I would watch the Transformers cartoon and Transformers in the movie and stuff, but there was always limitations because animation, you just can't get so much on a screen. So I remember that, and it was just really got me.
Yeah, I think it's like the density and like ephemeral nature of comics, because like even the longest, like monthly pamphlet comic, like it's going to take you maybe 10 minutes to read.
Right.
But there's so much information because of like the words and the pictures. And once you know the characters, like all those backstories are just kind of in your head. And it just gives you such a charged experience.
I'm kind of curious. You were saying that you kind of jumped into novels and you kept moving forward and everything. How do you feel that your reading habits involving comics evolved over the years?
For a long time, like late teen, or actually probably early 20s, actually. I didn't get back into comics till I was out of high school.
So
like
did
all
you
I
have a
read
gap?
were comics. Oh yeah, like Onslaught came out, and as like a Spider-Man and X-Men fan, the Clone Saga was going at the same time, and I was just done. Like I tapped out completely. It didn't help that like I'd recently discovered like Frank Miller's stuff. Sin City: The Big Fat Kill #5 was like my first cuss words and violence comic, and like my uncle had it like this old dog-eared copy of Ronin that I still have. Which was just like a whole new world of comics to me. So like the superhero stuff stopped doing it as much.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved overseas for a couple years and just didn't really have access to it.
I like the cuss words and violence genre, because I feel like I feel like a lot of people have that split. It's like you take a couple years off or a few years off. I remember the comic that got me into it was into the cuss words and violence was Preacher. And,
oh yeah.
And I had that, and then afterwards I kind of felt like it's not that I didn't still appreciate what superhero comics had to offer, but I was just like, it kind of opened me up to this whole new world. And after that, I was also in high school, so I took a few years off. So that kind of makes sense. I'm curious, where did you move?
I lived in Madrid, Spain for my senior year of high school.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I mean, I probably could have found comics. Like I found a comic shop named after Akira, and like I was buying Usagi Yojimbo off like maybe it was Amazon back then. But like I just wasn't in that space. But I did buy a copy of 300 in Spanish because I knew Frank Miller's name, and that actually helped me a lot with learning to speak the language. Weirdly, because he does very like short sentences and like easy to digest like concepts.
Yeah. How did you? I know you're a huge manga guy. Like, at what point did that start entering into your world? Was that when you were in Madrid, or was that after you got back into comics more full out?
I think it was just before and a little bit into when I lived in Madrid. I knew about anime because, again, like my uncle showed me, Akira, Fist of the North Star, Vampire Hunter D were like my first three. So I was like in the deep end immediately. But I didn't really know about like the comics aspect. Like I knew that there were Japanese comics, but not what they could do until the late 90s when I got, it must have been Super Manga Blast and a random Italian edition of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which
Oh yeah.
like I didn't have any context for until like last year when the anime came out.
Mm-hmm.
So like it was that kind of thing that I was into. I was getting more into like music and learning how to write. I was going to go to art school briefly, so like that took up a lot of my time. I was going to go to art school till I realized that I could write and that writing was slightly easier, and then I just stopped like any kind of drawing or charcoals at all.
That's interesting. That it was the easy aspect, but I could tell. I mean, just as an outsider, having read your stuff and just kind of following what you've done and everything, it definitely seems like you. I'm not going to say that you go exclusively look at art, because I kind of feel like you approach comics in more of a storytelling aspect, both from the writing and art standpoint. But it does seem like you have an extra love for the art aspect. So I'm not entirely surprised that you have a little art interest in your background.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where like I can't do it, and that makes it really interesting to me.
Yeah, that is 100% same here.
Yeah, I mean, even like I love basketball and I can kind of play, but like I can play defense. Like I'm not really out there hitting shots.
Right.
But I love watching basketball because I understand the rules of it, and then seeing them put into motion. It's like watching like a five-person chess game where they're all playing each other simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just something beautiful about it. And I feel similarly about comics art. Like when someone does something, like I'm at the point now where even lettering impresses me.
Yeah.
Like just the little tricks and like techniques people use to get the story across. And it's all curiosity, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating how like some of the stuff that people in comics do. Like I was watching this video. Marvel does these videos where they take people into the studios of artists, and they had Erica Henderson on, and she was doing this cover for Squirrel Girl, and I remember she did this. It was kind of like fast motion. It was like what's the word? Time lapse, and
Yeah.
she was doing the curve of Silver Surfer's board, and I honestly could watch that video on repeat just in that part, because like how smooth her motion is for that curve was just like, I don't know, it was like intoxicating. I couldn't even understand the wizardry it takes to be able to move in that smooth and straight of a motion at the same time.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction when I realized that people could use whiteout on a black page to indicate like stars and motion and stuff.
Yeah.
It's like just enough behind the scenes to where you're like, oh, I kind of get how you would do that, but like the experience, like, the 4 years of art school or whatever to get the experience to be able to do it is impressive.
I think one of the most amazing things about what they do is the fact that they get to the point where the problem solving gets them where they're like removing from a black page as opposed to adding to a white page. Like they're thinking about it in such a different way than I had ever even considered, because I don't know if it's a training thing or if it's like an innate ability or what, but I don't know. I was at an art show yesterday, and I was looking at these woodblock prints, and my wife was explaining it to me, and I was just like, holy crap. Like, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
And you have to wonder, like, who was the first person to be like, oh, I could do this?
I'm going to etch into this board, and I'm going to make it look amazing. I'm like, I don't even know how you did it, but you're an incredible person.
Yeah, and that's just so inspiring to me as both as a critic and as a writer more generally. Because it's all about craft, like seeing people excel at what they do or just like do something amazing, even if, their work is just okay. Everybody has like that moment where you're like, oh, geez, this person really knows their stuff.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
it's just creatively like energizing.
So going back to the manga stuff a little bit, do you think what was like? I know you're a big Frank Miller guy. You've mentioned him a couple times so far, and I know he was pretty manga influenced. Did that kind of aid the tie into jump into the manga world, or is that just something that kind of made it? I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like there's a connection there, and I can't really explain it.
Yeah, I think that it probably aided it in a subconscious way.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know the connection until like I was getting into like like Lone Wolf and Cub or Battle Angel Alita, which is full of like Frank Miller swipes, like straight up swipes, which is always fun. But like there's a shared language. Like people, American comics do close-ups in a certain way. Japanese comics are much more likely to do close-ups on eyes, from what I've seen,
Mm-hmm.
like for an emotional reaction. So there's like little, like very small storytelling things that you'll pick up on, like not even consciously. They're just there. You just understand them innately.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when you see like a manga plush or a sweat drop in an American comic. Now you're like, oh, that's a manga thing, but it makes perfect sense.
Right. Yeah.
And then you discover like, oh, these people are all into the same stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think that's one of the cooler things in that we're seeing over the last like. I mean, I have Frank Miller was one of the early ones, but it really feels like the manga influence has been hitting in like the last like 10 to 15 years. And I love having artists on and talking to them about it and seeing like the random people you wouldn't expect that have the manga influence, but it kind of impacts them in little storytelling ways. I don't know. It's kind of subtle for some people, and other people it's more overt. But I think it's really kind of omnipresent at this point.
Yeah, it's rare when I like, I talk to a lot of artists just for my job and just kind of in general. Like I'm kind of blessed to have the Twitter following that I do. And everyone likes, either Katsuhiro Otomo or Taiyo Matsumoto.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're on the list. Naoki Urasawa is always one where artists are like, "Holy crap, you can do this!" Which is
Mm-hmm.
another great thing to see online. I love that feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Urasawa is the one that actually really got me into manga. Like I'm obsessed with 20th Century Boys. I had like it went beyond wanting to read the comic and it became like a need to read the rest of that series.
Yeah, yeah, that was me with Monster.
Oh God, Monster is so good too.
Yeah, Monster's the only comic that like genuinely left me feeling tense. Like I read horror comics and be like, "Oh, that was kind of creepy," but like Monster, when I finished a volume, I had to like take a moment,
Yeah.
just to kind of calm down a little bit.
I do think that there's something to be said about that because it's like a lot of times when you read, and this isn't a condemnation of like the typical comic format and everything, but when you a lot of comics you read in the monthly format, you pick it up and you just pick up the next comic. But like you're saying with Monster, man, it's a heavy read, and when you're done with it, you're like, whew, I need some
Yeah.
time after that.
Doc Shaner, who does like Future Quest and a bunch of really great covers for DC, he just discovered Urasawa through Pluto, and he was tweeting about it.
Oh, that's
And,
awesome.
and he mentioned, like in the first volume, there's an interlude with a character named North Number Two or North Number Five, I forget exactly. But he's like, at first I was annoyed that there was this whole other story dropped in, and by the end I was in tears. And like that's what Urasawa does. Like
Yeah.
he kind of just ropes you in, and then you're hooked.
I think the amazing one of the underrated parts about manga, and I think it's one of the reasons why people have gotten into it. I'm curious as to how you got into it, but I got into it because my library, like
Mm.
my local library, has like a crazy amount of Urasawa stuff. It has just volumes after volumes of like Toriyama and everybody else, and I think libraries are very underrated for getting into that. I wonder how much of influence libraries have had in like the manga boom, I guess.
That's a good question. I know that it does very well now, though it's weird because they don't really like the super long running series.
Yeah.
Like a library going all in on One Piece is kind of not a bait and switch. It's a
Hmm.
tall order because there's 85 volumes of One Piece now.
Yeah.
But something like Pluto or something, like that 8 to 15 volume range is apparently the sweet spot.
Yeah.
For me, I never went to a library that had comics till I was grown,
Oh
like
wow.
almost into my 30s. Or if they did have comics, like I never found like the cool part of the library.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it all depends on the library you go to. I mean, you lived in San Francisco before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Berkeley Library has. I know that they have some of the people there are just like renowned for their comics love. So I
Oh
imagine.
yeah, Jack Bauer.
Yeah, Jack Bauer. I interviewed him for an all ages piece. That guy is smart.
Yeah, he is great. I did an event with him, Gene Yang, and Mariko Tamaki. So I was
Hmm.
like completely outclassed, but it was a fun time.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I want to actually. I have a hell of a loaded question for you, and it's something that I think about a lot when I think about manga.
Hmm.
Is the subjects of the stories are often so much more diverse than they are in American comics. Like I love basketball, I love food, I love sports in general, and like manga is loaded up with food comics. There's basketball comics. There's baseball, everything. As a much more prolific manga reader and someone who works in comics, why do you think that manga goes down those paths so much more than American comics do? Save for the perception that they just wouldn't sell.
I think it's just that the industry is that much more mature.
Yeah.
Um, the Wortham stuff, like when comics contracted, I want to say in the 70s and was it the 50s when like Captain Marvel went from being number one and then Superman kind of regained prominence.
Mm-hmm.
That it shrunk the audience, or maybe the places where you could buy comics, more importantly. While in Japan, like there's, especially in the Tokyo area, like you're going to spend so much time on trains that you need something to do.
Yeah.
And, anthology books make that easy. As kids, like anthology books is like, oh, I get X-Men, Spider-Man, Superman, and Batman. That's great. Let's go for it.
All the genres.
Yeah. And like having that firm foundation kind of lets the industry do pretty much whatever it wants. So while here, like the direct market is, it works, but there's like kind of a baseline like level for entry. Like you have to sell this much to survive. It's much, much like, I don't know. It's just the two markets are so different that they're kind of hard to compare. It's almost like apples to a different species of apple.
Yeah, yeah.
But like just the fact that the industry has made such strides over there in terms of just infiltrating the culture, being a part of the culture, rather makes it easy for like even Takahiko Inoue. He's done 3 different basketball comics over 20 years, and they're all great, which is awesome.
Yeah, that is really awesome. I think a good indication of how different, like, it just societally too, when you think about the fact that I remember on Twitter, I don't know if this still happens, but a few years ago there was like read comics in public day. And,
oh yeah.
And then you like, I remember I was in Japan, and like you're just taking a train anywhere, and everybody's just sitting and reading manga, and it's just kind of, or they're playing Nintendo DSs at that point. They're probably on to Switch now, but but at the time, I remember I was just like looking around, and I was like, wow, like this is a much different picture than you see in mass transit in America.
And one thing I think that kind of makes the difference is like there's a whole genre of comics for adult women in Japan. And like there are comics for adult women in the States and the West more generally, of course, but like just the density and like level of quality and craft and respect. Like Moyoko Ano, she did Insufficient Direction. She's married to Hideaki Anno, who did like Neon Genesis Evangelion. She gets newspaper comics or like magazine comics. That's what they hit her up for. Like that's the level she's working at.
That's awesome.
And that's so cool to me,
It is just way different. You're right. It is kind of comparing apples in a completely different species of apples. It's like it's easy to compare them on the surface, but in reality, it's Japan has just reached a pervasiveness in the medium that we just can't really compare to.
Also, like another subtler thing is shipping costs. Japan is much, much smaller than the United States, so even just getting books from coast to coast is like a cost a lot of people don't think about.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to touch on that later because I'm curious as to how. I'll just touch on now. Is that something that you knew about before jumping into Image, or is that something you kind of now that you're kind of inside at a publisher and everything that you started being a little bit more conscientious of elements like that?
I think the latter. Like I kind of vaguely knew about it just because I spend too much time thinking about comic books. But like being at a publisher, like seeing like having to do like comp lists for books that I work on and things like that, like you really realize how many different places comics go to. Because if an issue of Whatever Man #1 comes out, it goes to comic shops, which are all across the country. But like maybe your writer's from Brazil, your letterer's from Portugal, your artist is from Thailand or Indonesia. Like they have to get copies too. And then eventually, like the comics will make their way to their stores and locally translated. And you kind of see the machine, I guess, and that sort of makes it gives it more prominence in my head. Where before I would have like been like, oh yeah, of course, Japan's tiny compared to us. Now it's more like a better understanding of what that means.
Right. Yeah, I remember when I went to Australia, and I remember going into a comic shop in Brisbane, and I was just blown away. I mean, it makes sense that their comics would be more expensive. I think it was like $6.99, like Australian dollars. And
oof. Yeah,
I know. I mean, that's a chunk of change. And at the same time, I mean, they have to get them shipped there. I mean, it's the cost to get them there is incredible. I mean, if you're an Australian comic fan, you're probably a pretty hardcore comic fan.
Yeah, and that's true of South American fans as well.
Yeah.
Like I know a few people who live in like Argentina or Brazil, and just reading comments on manga sites, like they're like, please just put out a digital edition. I can read English and just let me buy it kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is definitely the digital thing. I wonder how much that's changed markets like Australia and like Argentina and beyond, because I imagine that makes it a lot more accessible and a lot more inexpensive. I wonder if that's really impacting retail stores in those areas, like the comic shops that do exist. That is a very deep question, but I wonder if that's happening.
My guess is that it ended up sort of like it is here, where the digital leads to increased awareness. So kind of like more people could end up at a comic shop.
It's additive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But so getting into you writing about comics, why did you dive into that world? Was it just because you're actively thinking about it so much and you wanted to find an outlet for those thoughts?
I was on message boards in the early 2000s.
Were you a Warren
Just
Ellis
because,
forums guy?
no, I missed that. I was on
Oh,
fighting game message boards, which should probably go unmentioned. But we would talk about comic books, like video games, all that stuff. And eventually, I got a job writing about comic books, kind of doing reviews and things like that. And from there, I was like, oh wait, I can review stuff. I should, I talk about comics all the time. Let's do that. And I applied to Silver Bullet Comics, did like an open call for writers, and I didn't get in, but like I
hmm.
kept at it after that. It was one of those like, well, if you're not going to take me, I'm going to make my own party sort of things.
So that kind of drove you a little bit. You're like, well, I'm gonna make my own thing. Let's do it.
Yeah, because I knew that, I knew I was good enough to be published, so I was like, all right, well, I'll just publish myself.
Hmm.
And it was fun talking about books. Like, originally, I was just doing like straight reviews, like, oh, here's how good this comic was, and then it got into kind of talking about the themes of the books that I was reading or like the emotions that it gave me.
Hmm.
There's a Spider-Man arc. I can't remember the name of it. It was during the Clone Saga. It was one of the few that I liked, but it has like Shriek and Doppelganger and Carnage and all that nonsense in it. But it was one where Spider-Man like just stopped telling jokes, like he was that like traumatized and angered by what was going on.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's extremely good. Mark Bagley drew it. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was like when Aunt May was in the hospital, like that era of the Clone Saga.
Hmm.
And I was like, as a kid, this scared me because Spider-Man was the funny, well-adjusted guy.
Right.
And in here, he just kind of gives over to being kind of like a little bit more like the Punisher.
Right.
He's not killing anybody, but it's extremely violent.
Hmm.
And like I love talking about that stuff because it's not about how good the book is so much as how it makes you feel.
Right. Well, and I think that, I mean, not to dive too much into that comic, but at the same time, it's like, it's nice seeing comics that have, like, Marvel's always been about the illusion of change, but like those comics, like, is seeing something where it makes them feel a little bit more real. Because frankly, if you had all these clones and you had like Infinity people trying to kill you and your aunt was in the hospital, you'd probably be pretty pissed.
Yeah, and no kidding. Like there was always this thing that I noticed as a kid, and I still have yet to like find an actual explanation for it. But there was no cussing in Marvel comics when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jim Starlin got across like a few like minor swear words in Warlock in the 70s, but DC Comics would use like damn and hell and that kind of thing.
Right.
And that always struck me because there were like several points in Marvel books where I was like, oh, I would cuss up a storm right here. You know?
Yeah, I feel like Peter Parker definitely has had many opportunities to do so. I recently wrote a piece for The Ringer about Spider-Man and like his kind of recent history and things like that. And in the process, I reread a lot of Spider-Man comics, and man, that dude has had a tough life. I would be like a PTSD total train wreck if I were him.
I mean, I would have to retire. Like, there's no, like, just a year of Spider-Man's life is the worst in the world.
Yeah. It's like people are like, oh, he's so great, he's so fun. I'm just like, he is internally, he's got to be an absolute train wreck.
Yeah, he's got to have 8 different therapists. You know?
And one of them is the Vulture.
Yeah.
I came up on forums too. I was actually weirdly I was in a pop punk music forum was how I started talking about comics. And one of the weird things for me was I actually didn't grow up with any comic friends up here in Alaska. I didn't know anyone who read comics. Did you have any in real life comic friends, or is it really forums were kind of your outlet?
Yeah, it was mostly when I was younger, like around the time Image was coming out, because we moved around a lot as a kid, so it was tough sometimes. But we would trade comics, so we'd get like a price guide or a wizard. We're like, oh, so like this X Force is worth blah blah blah. This Spider-Man you want is worth blah blah blah. Give me Spider-Man and that, and you can have the X Force.
Right.
Which I talked to other comics fans, and some get it, and others are horrified. And which I think is maybe a regional thing. We were, a small town in the South.
Oh, I totally did that. I did that with sports cards too.
Yeah, no, exact same thing. So I did have comics fans probably up through 5th or 6th grade. We would draw Ninja Turtles. Like I remember that really, really strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they were the cartoon turtles, we didn't even know there was a comic book just because of our age back then.
Mm-hmm.
But no, like I feel like my memories of comics as a kid, everyone read them until everyone didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, probably just perception, blinders. I'm sure people are still reading comics.
I think it became something that people like weirdly did in secret, as if it was like a scarlet letter or something like that.
Yeah, like they became uncool at some point by
Right.
unspoken decree.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very fascinating thing. I mean, I think that was a portion of why I stopped reading comics was I was like 15 and I was like horrified of people finding this other side of me, despite the fact that I loved it. And weirdly, I probably shouldn't admit this in public, but it was like it took my mom shaming me to get back into comics. She was like, "You love comics. Why did you stop reading them?" I'm like, "Okay." She's like, "I'll buy
Wow.
you a comic. Let's go to the comic shop. I'm gonna buy you whatever you want. We're gonna do this." I'm like, "Okay." And then I got back into comics.
That's like the opposite of my experience.
What did your mom anti-shame you out of it?
She saw a bunch of Jim Lee X-Men, and like in a way to kind of gently make me recognize that women are people, she was like, "Why are these ladies dressed so provocatively?"
I imagine it was Psylocke.
Yeah, definitely Psylocke. Probably the bit in the early X-Men where she's like Cyclops is just hallucinating her for no reason all the time.
Right. Yeah.
But she was kind of she was trying to say like, oh, like, hey, maybe these drawings aren't healthy for a young boy to take in.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It is kind of funny how we had this huge dichotomy experiences there, but I know that there's, and when it comes to people writing about comics, there's this perception that it's just a gateway so you can get into making comics or working in comics in general. Was that ever your plan, or is it just kind of an outlet?
It was an outlet, which makes my current situation ironic, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. But no, so there was one point when I did want to write comics, but not Marvel DC stuff. I wanted to do my own. And then I just kind of felt like, wait, I'm just going to make comics into homework for myself.
Right.
It's more fun to read than to make them, or to like help people make them than to be, like the primary mover.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wrote for years just because I like talking about comics, and then I backed my way into a comics job.
Yeah. I think it's funny that you said the homework thing, because one of the things my dad said to me when I was younger that always sticks with me is he's like, be careful about making your hobby your job because it might make you like it less. And I that always sticks with me because like I never actually had any interest in making comics, but getting jobs in comics kind of appealed to me to some degree. Actually, my ultimate goal is to own my own comic shop because I'm a crazy person.
Oh wow. Yeah.
And despite the fact that I know a ton about how the industry works and the distribution model and everything, I still am unrelenting in that desire. But I don't know. It is kind of interesting. How do you feel that? I know this is kind of jumping ahead a bit, but do you feel like that working in comics has kind of changed how you feel about them or your kind of relationship with them at all?
Yeah, definitely. It goes in waves like anything else. But like I spent a lot of time earlier this year pretty much just reading like novels, like Jack Reacher type stuff, and not so many comics. Right now I'm very much in like a manga phase. I'm catching up on Nichijou and Dissolving Classroom that a coworker let me borrow.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I'll loop back to comics and catch up on, a bunch of stuff I like there, like East of West, probably Black Panther or New Superman, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just almost like I read until I don't feel compelled to read.
Right.
And then like I eventually loop back around, like, oh, like I liked what Gene Yang was doing on New Superman. Let me go back and see what he was up to.
Mm-hmm.
Which is great because then I can read a bunch at once instead of just, like once a month.
Yeah, I actually I was feeling pretty burned out on it, and I don't even have a job in comics. I do all this, but I switched to trades on a lot of stuff and kind of really streamlined my monthly buying habits to the stuff that I'm like. I have arbitrary rules. It's like if I was double digits into it already, or if it's something I'm like so crazy compelled to get that I have to, like Black Monday Murders. I'm a huge Hickman fan, so I picked that up. I would keep going. And it is kind of interesting. Even doing that and just reading it more in chunks than I did in the past has kind of changed my experience quite a bit.
Yeah, and even like, so I grew up on Spider-Man and like I'll love Spider-Man forever.
Mm-hmm.
But I even hit a point where I was like, oh, I don't necessarily need Spider-Man anymore.
Right.
Like I've had my run and now, some other people get to have theirs. And the weird part was like, I was like, oh, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like the opposite of most nostalgic reactions. But that kind of opened me up to being like, like maybe I don't need this character or this book or this kind of story in my life anymore.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think if you're doing something out of duty, then it may not. It kind of changes your relationship with it.
Yeah, definitely. It makes you. I mean, it's like people say that it's like knowing how the sausage is made, but it's like knowing how the sausage is made and still really loving sausage. It just makes you picky about the sausage. It doesn't make you hate it.
That is a very good analogy, or addition to the analogy.
Yeah. Because before I worked in comics, my day job, like my actual day job, like sitting at a desk day job, was video game kind of marketing, consulting, creative services stuff. And after I quit that, I barely played games for a year.
Oh, yeah.
Because I only wanted to play like the stuff I knew was really good, stuff that I hadn't worked on and like knew the story behind, so like it was ruined for me,
Mm-hmm.
or just like the new indie hotness. So I just like took a break and came back. Eventually, like regained my love down the line.
Yeah. I have to ask, this is a super random aside, but I've been really thinking
Yeah.
about playing this game called Hyper Light Drifter. Did you ever play it?
No, I didn't. I have friends who swear by it though.
Yeah, I've seen. I really like these two dudes who write about video games for The Ringer, and they have a podcast called Achievement Oriented,
Hmm.
and they called it one of the top 10 games last year, and it kind of really strikes my fancy as like an old school. I don't know. I grew up on like JRPGs and things like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
and so like that really is. It kind of feels like that mixed with like some action elements, and that really appealed to me. So I figured I'd ask as a video game guy.
No, yeah, it has amazing art design. That's what kind of caught
Yeah.
my attention.
Yeah, it looks really beautiful. I heard the sound is really good too.
Hmm.
So this is going back into writing. I want to ask about the outlets you wrote for, because you were, I would say, the two outlets you were most noted for writing for were Fourth Letter, which was your own gig that you shared with a couple buds, and then
Hmm.
Comics Alliance. They felt like way different outlets for you. I'm sure they had to be. How different was your approach between the two? Did you have like a pretty good idea of the kind of stuff you do at CA and what you do at Fourth Letter? Was there like delineation there?
There was like to the point where Laura Hudson, the my editor lady who brought me on, she was like, just write it like you would at Fourth Letter after a certain point, because I was trying to match like a certain voice that I thought they wanted at Comics Alliance,
Like your
as opposed
Comics
to making
Alliance
it my
voice?
voice. Yeah. So like I don't know what I thought that voice was, but like I just wasn't hitting the mark, and then I had to like loosen up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because at Fourth Letter, I would just write whatever I wanted, however I wanted. It was almost like a sandbox in the like programming sense.
Mm-hmm.
So if I wanted to spend like a month just writing about, the rap band The Roots, like I could do that and nobody could tell me no,
Right. Yeah.
which is great for learning how to write, by the way. Like I highly recommend having just a place where you can screw around. But yeah, so like on my site, it was just anything goes. Gavin and I would, he wrote about wrestling a bunch. I ended up writing about like a lot of really traumatic news, race related things, but
Mm-hmm.
it was still a comic site. But for Comics Alliance, I knew that the spotlight was bigger. More people read it. Different people read it. Like it was much more read by like actual comics industry people as opposed to creators.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to be a little more like the Comics Journal or Publishers Weekly with it.
Sure.
But then once I kind of found my voice there and started doing, I think, weirder and weirder stuff there, that I kind of like hit my stride.
Mm-hmm. What do you think it was like? What do you think the biggest things that helped you improve as a writer? It sounds like part of it was just like putting in the reps and trying things out and figuring things out. But what do you think the biggest things that helped you improve were?
Repetition and never being happy with what I do.
Yeah.
Like everything, pretty much every piece I ever wrote, at least on Fourth Letter, was like kind of me talking to myself, trying to crystallize how I felt about something.
Mm-hmm.
And I would use kind of the comments to gauge how effective a job I had done,
Mm.
which is hairy on any other site. But like I actually moderated my comments, so it was like a pretty good crew most times
Mm-hmm.
until we got outside attention. But it's just that, just like looking back at what you've done and like not being afraid to grow up in public, because you're gonna have to. Like you can't get better at writing without writing, and if you're just writing for yourself, you can kind of hedge your bets a little bit. But when you're writing for people, whether I was writing, even when I was writing for myself, I knew someone else was going to read it, and keeping that in mind and making sure that your points aren't too opaque or too like slathered in your own cleverness to actually be understood.
Mm-hmm.
It's just all kind of stripping. It's like the metaphor about like the statue is always inside the marble. You just have to chip away at it until it's revealed.
Yeah.
That's how I look at like learning the craft of writing is you know how to communicate. It's just figuring out how to do it in the most efficient way.
Yeah. Fine tuning it.
Yeah.
I feel like the things that helped me learn the most were when I really took my lumps. Like the thing that probably the piece that I learned the most for was I had this idea that I was going to write this like long form, like thoughtful piece because I was inspired by Warren Ellis's "Come In Alone" column from CBR back in the day. I
Oh
found
yeah,
this.
yeah.
I found this random book. Like I was in. I don't even remember where I was. I think it was in a comic shop in Portland actually, and I found this copy of it and I was like, what is this? It's a Warren Ellis book. I don't know. I'm like, there's no comics in here. It's just words. And so I read it and it was inspired by it. So I wrote this piece and like, it was bad. It was like, I thought I was so proud of it. It was bad though. And the lowest moment is I shared it with Warren Ellis and he told me, quote unquote, I was staggeringly wrong in my piece. And I like there has never been a moment in my life in terms of writing that was more productive for my ability to become a better writer than being told that I was staggeringly wrong by a person that I held on like the highest of pedestals for comics. After that, I got a lot better. But it is, I mean, do you feel like taking your lumps helped you at all?
Oh, 100%. One of my favorite feelings now, it's a weird favorite. This makes me sound like a masochist, but when I Google something and then I find my own site and I read what I wrote about it, like 5, 6, 10 years ago, and I'm like, that's dumb. Like that is a weirdly like a sign of growth for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I was when was I doing this site? From 2005 to 2012 maybe. I forget. We had 10 years, however, whatever that math works out to. But it was basically just my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And apologies to anyone still in their 20s, but like you very quickly realize how dumb you are in your early 20s.
Yep.
Like once you hit your late 20s, you're like, wait a minute, what have I been doing this entire time? But the bad news is that happens again in your early 30s. So I think it's just a constant stream of self-loathing going on.
Yeah, it's definitely revisionist history on your own life.
Yeah, like, oh, I shouldn't have been that guy. But
Yeah.
with writing, like that teaches you, it's like you can start to look at your argument as how would I rebut myself? Like, what was I thinking when I did this? It's like a really deep dive into your own work. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's just, well, you didn't look at X, Y, and Z. But sometimes it's when you were 25, you were going through this thing, and now you're not anymore. So it's not the same interpretation.
Yeah,
Like, have you read Solanin by Inio Asano, the manga?
I have not.
It's extremely good, but it's about a young lady having a quarter-life crisis, and I read it pretty much during the middle of mine, and it was like the most resonant, beautiful, amazing book. Like, I'll be a fan for life, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine, Bridget Alverson, she writes a lot about like library manga, like all ages comics, that kind of thing. She was like, "This book sucks. It's just a bunch of 20-somethings being 20-somethings, and I don't like it." And like having that conversation helped me because I was like, "Here's how I feel. Here's how she feels. Neither of us are wrong. It's not even that the truth is in the middle. It's that the truth can have several different, it's like a diamond or something like that, or some type of crystal."
It's relative.
Yeah. And that kind of led me down a path of not reading good reviews of things that I like. I'd rather read the bad reviews or the ones that I disagree with, because then it makes me sharpen my sword.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, like I love Armand White. I'm the one guy on Comics Internet who's like, "What's this guy got this week? Let me see what he's got to say." Because I don't even agree, but I know that he's put in his time and he's done his work to where even if he's being a contrarian curmudgeon, he's going to say something that will make me think about, how much I like Fast and the Furious or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I think that, there's much been written about like people living in echo chambers, but I think it's worthwhile finding perspectives that are I'm not saying that like you should chase down like absolutely insane people, but find perspectives
definitely not.
Yeah, like find perspectives that are reasonable, that are different than yours, and maybe can help improve your own perspective to a degree.
Yeah, and especially as a writer, I think that you're only as good as your last piece.
Right.
So you kind of have to do the cross training in between. Like, what are you thinking about? What are you reading? What are you putting in your head?
Yeah. I want to ask. So I read in an interview you did with Tom Spurgeon that you spoke about some of the people you really respect who write about comics and how they and like the competitive drive they give you makes you better at what you do. How big of a driving factor is competition for you? But not just in comics, but in life.
It's weird. Like, now that I'm getting older, I love like stories about friendship. So it's less like active competition and more like, oh, I got to stay on his level, stay on, like she's really doing great stuff. How do I keep up? So I think it's pretty huge. Like, I'm not a dick about competition.
You're not trying to like
it's fun.
Destroy people.
Yeah, no, I just want to be like, all right, that was a good piece, but I bet I could do better. One of my good friends, like Tucker Stone, a man that I love a whole bunch, like we're real life friends, brothers pretty much.
And he works for one of the best publishers.
Yeah, he works for Nobrow. Like, somehow we both, of all the people on Comics Internet, made it into the industry. But I first became friends with him because he set a comic on fire as a stunt. And it made the entire internet mad. But then, like, 2 weeks later, I got it, and I wrote him an email. I was like, hey, man, I thought this was dumb as heck, but now it's really making me laugh. And ever since, we've just got along.
That's awesome.
And we've got kind of similar tastes, but we're, like, jerks about comics in different ways. So we just like mesh really well. And so like writing along, I did one piece alongside him where we looked at the Don McGregor, Billy Graham, Black Panther, like Panther's Rage, all that stuff. That's like a highlight for me because we're almost one-upping each other with essays, like intentionally. Like it became direct competition as opposed to passive.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that kind of stuff is good for you. I mean, again, not to destroy people, but like having, competition really drives me. Like when I see, like I really like Oliver Sava's stuff for AV Club, and whenever I see him like come up with something great, I just like I feel the itch to like do something, like not a response, but something big for myself. I'm like, why am I not writing like that? Damn, Oliver's good. I gotta up my game.
Yeah. And I'm a 3-time Eisner loser, so.
I'm a one-time Eisner loser. I was with Multiversity Comics, and I no, actually, I guess Comics Alliance wasn't nominated that year. CBR won that year, and
Yeah.
it was very sad. We had a big Google Hangout of like 10 Multiversity writers, and we all got to share in real time when we lost. It was sad. So I actually I'm gonna do something very cruel, because you mentioned how looking back at your own writing, you're like, oh, what was that person thinking? I read something randomly. I don't even know how I came across it. That you wrote in 2012 on Fourth Letter about how you were possibly thinking about starting a podcast. And it largely, I was going to read out the whole quote, but largely it was about how your perspective of comic industry interviews are kind of a bummer, and how they don't really go as in depth into the subjects as you would like. Largely I agree. I agree with 2012 David Brothers. I read a lot of interviews for prepping for this, and a lot of them kind of fall down on just the straight plot questions, to the point where I read an interview with somebody the other day where the person was effectively asking them what happens at the end of this book that hasn't even had a number one come out yet. I'm curious. I'm turning this into a positive direction, I swear. Looking at it now, what makes a good comic book interview?
Oh man. First, I want to say that I don't remember writing that, but that definitely sounds like something I would say, which is a feeling that I love so much. But no, what makes a good comic interview? I would say follow-up questions.
Yeah.
Like hands down, that's like the one thing that I think, even if you're doing like plot questions, you could be like, what happens next? And then have like a good follow-up. It's like, okay, so how does that make them feel?
Right.
Why did she do that? That kind of thing. There was a point, it might have been in 2012, when I was reading a bunch of interviews from like higher up comics people about maybe things they should have handled better as companies or as creators, and they were just kind of like the comics people using the interviewers as a mouthpiece.
Sure.
Like you've seen those interviews where it's like clearly the interviewer was on the hook and there's just nothing really of value. And all I could think was, if you just asked one more question after this, when they said they were going to do blah blah blah, if you just said why, you would have had a great interview as opposed to just like a so-so one.
Right.
Because I think we look like sometimes, like myself included, we're like, oh, we have XYZ artist, like, they're the biggest name in the industry. She's drawn the best comic in the world. And we look at that as the get. But the actual get is what they're going to say. And you have a level of control over that when you're interviewing someone, because you're kind of guiding the conversation. So, like, if you're not asking follow-ups, I feel like you're just wasting an opportunity. You're just following a script as opposed to kind of like actually digging into a subject.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's kind of a victim of the form email interview where you send a chunk of questions, and like if you don't have follow-ups, that you got nothing. And it is, I do think that's a very key part of it. I'm a big fan of follow-up interviews. Email, I always recommend to other writers that instead of just doing it in a big chunk, if the creator is amenable, do like one or two questions and then go back and forth so you can actually have some level of flow to it. Not everyone has time for that, because it turns out comic creators are really busy, especially if they're artists. But I don't know. I mean, I think that I think your points are well met. It is, comic interviews are very interesting to me, not just because I have a podcast, but because I feel like people put this stuff too much on a pedestal. Like, a lot of it should be conversational, and it never really feels like that.
Yeah. And even if you're doing an email interview, when I would do the pitch, I would say, hey, I have 7 to 8 questions for you, and maybe one or two more after I see your answers.
Sure.
Like, kind of bake in the follow-up. But yeah, the pedestal, like, so much of comics making is mundane.
Right.
But like, I can't remember who, but she was describing like drawing a page and like kind of the flow of her arm across a page. I was like, oh, the physical aspect of comics making is something we hardly ever talk about. Whether it's like how much of a drain it is on your body, going by all the broken shells of human beings of artists that I know, like the mental aspect where you're just drawing alone for days at a time. Like, that kind of stuff is really interesting, but not marketing. I mean, in my opinion, it could be. Like, I feel like it humanizes the creator, and that pays for it in how you pay attention to them. but it doesn't have like a direct benefit. Like it won't get your comic sold.
I have to say that's one of the things I liked about your iWord podcast interviews is didn't you talk to Matt Wilson about like his like crazy fitness stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like
Though I think he's gotten like even more intense since then.
yeah, like I think that stuff is super interesting. Especially, I mean, like I find the whole like I feel like there could be a really interesting article written about like the health part of comic creators, especially artists who sit there who hopefully have a standing desk, and have like they're there 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. How do they stay in shape? How do they stay not broken? Like Greg Capullo, I don't know if you ever met Greg Capullo, but that dude is a beefcake, and.
Yeah.
That guy, I saw him on Twitter the other day. He said he works 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, and like, where does he have time to like get ripped? I don't know.
Yeah, you have to force it.
Yeah.
Tucker Stone, he's a CrossFit guy. Erica Henderson works out. I think Meredith Grand was lifting. She might still be. I haven't checked in a while. But there's such like an undercurrent of fitness and almost extreme fitness in comics that gets missed because of like this dumb Knox, my goodness, jocks versus nerds thing.
Yeah,
They were trapped in for some dumb reason. But it's fascinating. A lot of comics are martial artists. They bring that to their work. Others are, like really into yoga or something like that. Like it's human.
I will say that nothing will ever top Nick Dragata being a badass RC car driver.
Yes, this is my favorite evolution that he's had so far. I saw him last time I went back to Oakland. We hung out for a while. We got burgers. He showed me like an RC car track, and it's just the coolest thing. Like I want an RC car now.
Oh yeah, like I think
like I went in.
I think RC stuff, like ever since I was a kid, even as an adult, I love RC planes, and I think people who similarly to artists in a weird way, I feel like people who fly RC planes are like wizards in their ability to land those things. I'm actually weirdly more impressed by RC plane drivers than I am actual pilots.
Because flying is totally mundane now.
Exactly.
Like no one gets dressed up to go to the airport.
Right, exactly. It's just this rote thing that you do in your life.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to move into the present. How did
Yep.
how did the image job come together?
I realized that I had to quit my video game job because my boss was either cheating me or dumb, and like I couldn't take either one.
Right.
And pretty much around that time, I got a message like, "Hey, are you happy in your job?" And they needed a proofreader at Image because like there hadn't been one before I got hired, and the company's I think it was 21-year history at that point. So I came on and I became the guy who read every Image comic and told people what they got wrong.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I was part of the production team, which is like super unsung. They're some of my favorite people in comics. They work so hard and pretty much always get it right. So like I was right there, like talking to creators, being like, "Hey, here's a list of things of notes that I always call them notes because I feel like errors was way too aggressive. Here's a bunch of notes that I found. Like, let us know what you want us to fix and what you want to fix on your side," and then they'd send it back, and then we'd send it to press.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I do want to give a quick shout out to the production side too. I was trying to, I actually just knocked my own microphone over because I was trying to reach a copy of Rumble. I think is it Vincent Kakua who does the design for Rumble?
Yeah, Vince is such a good dude. He just got back from a Hawaii Comic-Con too. He makes comics. He's a fantastic person. Like he's just a total package.
Yeah, I feel like the design side or like production and design side of like publishers, like Boom has a ton of really good publisher or designers too, and like they are so underrated in the world of comics because I don't know, I feel like there's always like the colorist appreciation day, and then now September 1st is letter appreciation day, and I feel like a lot of times like the people who actually work for the publishers get like a bum rap because they're like the man, and
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of really talented people out there, and they just nobody even knows about them.
Yeah, you were asking about differences between things I felt coming into comics and like before I got into the industry, like the production, like the office side of things. I've got a lot more appreciation for now.
Yeah,
Like especially basically if you have a strong accounting department and a strong production department, you can make your company a success.
yeah.
Like people will come to you.
Also, I think that the marketing people are underrated. I even though I feel like Kat Salazar probably has like 25 reasons to hate me at this point, the fact that her and Bria are all still so nice to me speaks to their abilities as both people and employees of Image.
Yeah, we're all trying to get to the same place in the end, I guess.
Yeah. So, were you trepidatious at all about working for a publisher?
I knew how it would look, especially being the guy who was like, working in comics, whatever.
Right.
But like I needed a job and had to pay rent, so I was kind of in with both feet.
Mm-hmm.
I was nervous, kind of just how it would go, like normal new job nerves, I think.
Yeah.
But I talked with Stevenson before, and he was like, "Yeah, keep writing about comics. Don't say anything too crazy." Uh, and so I was like, "All right, well, cool. This seems pretty supportive and interesting. It's a new challenge that kind of like played to my strengths,
Mm-hmm.
which is just like reading comics. Really, I joke that my entire job has just been reading comics really well for a few years now. uh, so I mean, once I was in, I was in. And I'm from kind of like an old school work ethic,
Yeah.
so both feet down, head down until the job's done, and the job's not done until the job is done.
I kind of feel like your job initially at Image was like the comic book equivalent of Josh Baskin's job in the movie Big. You just get to play with toys all day.
Yeah. And then eventually, then it becomes a job, and you're like, oh man, there are so many comics that come out each month.
Mm-hmm.
But that was another thing that I thought that made Image kind of fun in the early days. Is like I was getting started was I would work closely with the production artist and the production manager, Jonathan Chan at the time.
Yeah.
And we ended up finding ways to make the process smoother because I was like the new guy on the block with an outside perspective. So I could point out, I was like, oh, like this seems really obtuse. Why do we do this? Why don't we, go down this route instead, which is much faster, and we can like look back and reference things.
Mm-hmm.
And together we kind of like upgraded Drew Gill too. He helped a lot with that. We upgraded kind of the production process
That's awesome.
and made it so that like no one really has to stay after like 6 or 6:30 on Friday nights anymore on printer
good.
days. Yeah,
I bet that makes you popular around the office.
everybody loves me.
So you start off as the proofreader, so to speak.
Yeah,
But how
content manager was the official title.
content manager? So I know that you edited several books. I know, like, I believe you're still editing Lazarus, right?
Yeah, Lazarus is my only ongoing project right now. I help out Ronald Wimberly sometimes with Gratuitous Ninja on Stela, and I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. You're now the branding manager. How is your? I mean, obviously it's a different title. How has your role evolved since you started?
It's completely different now. Now I have to actually like sit down and read the books as opposed to having them, just like passed to me as part of a process.
Sure.
Which changes like how I read and when. I mostly catch up in chunks, like I was saying before. But a big part of my job now is going to conventions and doing like all the panels and that kind of thing because somehow I'm good at them. I don't know. But I think it's just an extension of like doing interviews for a website. It's like live comics criticism. And then, I edit Image Plus, our like official magazine. It's like a previews supplement where we go over all of our debuts and show preview pages, do deep interviews and that kind of thing. And that's the editor position is kind of new to me. I briefly edited popcultureshock.com years and years ago, but I was like 22 or something. It was a bad decision all around. But now I kind of like, now that I've been a writer for like 14 or 15 years, now that I've worked with editors for a long time, I'm kind of making a magazine the way I would have wanted to do when I was a younger writer.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I spend a lot of time, I don't want to say herding cats. It always sounds like so condescending, but like working with my freelancers and making sure they've got the info they need, making sure the creators have the stuff that we need on the way, and then making sure that the magazine itself is a cohesive whole. Like It makes sense that how the features translate or transition from one to the next. Like I put a lot of thought into, probably more thought than is healthy. But yeah, so like I've transitioned to almost just doing like public facing marketing type stuff as opposed to like press facing, like what Kat Bria and our new guy Fitz does. Because also I work on the Image website, like doing content for that, which are mostly just like unabridged interviews rather than like promo pieces or something of that nature.
I do want to give you props on your public facing part because I did see you MC the Image Expo event at the Showbox in Seattle in 2016.
Oh yeah,
you did a great job.
Thank you. The secret is that I wing those pretty much.
Yeah.
Just because it's not that I'm great at improv or whatever, but something I had to learn is to trust myself when I'm on stage because I can't really refer to notes necessarily. So I'll have like a notebook up there in case I'm like, oh crap, what's Gail Simone famous for? If somehow I have some kind of crazy brain fart, I can refer back. But it's almost easier just to treat it like a house party, where it's like, hey, this is my new friend so and so. They're going to tell you what they're going to do and what they're all about for a little bit.
I remember distinctly that I don't remember who the creator was, but there was somebody where you were basically extracting the plot of their comic out of them, and you did a very good job of making it feel natural without like making it feel like they didn't know what they were talking about. It was a very nice balance. I heard it was blinding up there though.
Yeah, it was insane. There was one light that was pointing directly at the podium, I guess for like picture purposes, but it made it so I couldn't see any of the audience. But no, like that creator thing, that's something that like I've kind of learned a lot about now that I'm working at a company. And I think that when you're at a publisher, when you're at any kind of company in particular, your clients have to trust you. And I don't think client is like the right word for the image comics and creator relationship, but it's like the easiest right now.
Right.
So if you put them on stage and hang them out to dry, like that's not a cool move,
No.
you know? And I talk to people before we do panels, before we do expos. I'm just like, hey, you know, I've done a lot of these. I will do a lot of these in the future. If you need a hand, just tell me and we'll figure something out. And there have been times when someone was like, listen, I'm extremely nervous. I don't want to go out there. Can you like tee me up and we'll just have like a quick conversation and I'll introduce them and then say, so what's your book about? And then they're off at the races. Like they're totally fine after that. So all it takes is breaking the ice. So I just try to be attentive to that kind of thing.
It seems like I mean, obviously every person's different, but it is kind of interesting seeing the differences between like some people are actually like natural show people, like they go up there and they just have it locked down, and other ones like it definitely feels like you have like this symbiotic relationship where you help them through it. And I don't know, I mean, I was very impressed by how smooth that was.
Yeah, thank you. It's always like a daunting process, but not one that I get nervous about, if that makes sense. Like I know it's going to be a lot, but I also know that like I've been here before.
Right.
This San Diego was actually the first time I got nerves for a panel in a long time because I was interviewing like the heads of like 5 of the biggest manga publishers in the U.S.
Oh wow.
And like I'm a manga fan, and I feel like I know a little bit about a little bit, but I was like, man, this is the deep end. Like, what am I gonna do? And so I sat down, I wrote down some questions just as prep, and then once I started doing that, I was like, oh, like I've got this. Like this was so easy to figure out what to say. And then, you know, the panelists always make it easy. If you ask people about things that they care about or they're passionate about or hate, which is always a fun one, you're going to get like something good in response.
Yeah.
Like most people are pretty, you know, most people like people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you make it a conversation where they feel comfortable, that's really kind of what it's all about. It is always tricky managing so many personalities at one time. Like trying to make all 5 people feel like they're equally represented, that can be tough.
Yeah, it's something I don't know if I have it down yet, but I try. And
Yeah.
I think a big part of it at panels is like most companies will do a PowerPoint panel where it's like, we're going to go through everything coming up on sale pretty soon and then do some Q&A and then we're going to leave. So like some people talk for 5 minutes and they're on stage for 50 and they're like, well, this sucks. So I try to skip around on the stage a lot. So like I'll introduce everyone in hopefully in alphabetical order, not all the time. And then I'll just go like, all right, let's start at this random point and then go from there. And that kind of gets everybody into the conversation. Like people, like I love crosstalk on panels. All that stuff is great to me.
I think it's it's important having a plan, but also it's important to have a plan, but also to be flexible. I think sometimes people have a plan, but they're not flexible, or they're flexible, but they don't have a plan. And like it's like you have to kind of have a balance of both of those things.
Oh, definitely. Like I say I wing these panels, but I still have, like gigs of information, be it comics or, bios or something like that backing me up. Like that stuff is still in my head.
Yeah.
So when like I interviewed Marjorie Liu for her spotlight panel at San Diego. So I kind of know that I could ask her about like X-23, her grandparents during World War II, fighter jets, cast. Like there's this whole constellation of things I kind of know about Marjorie. And because she's like, extremely good at interviews and panels, like I know that she'll have a great answer no matter what I ask.
Weirdly, the first time I was introduced to Marjorie Liu was not in person, but my friend, I was at a bookstore with her, and my friend loves romance novels, and she picked up a Marjorie Liu romance novel. And I mean, is it the same Marjorie Liu?
Yeah.
That's what I thought. Yeah, and I remember I was like, is that the X-23 Marjorie Liu? This is so weird to me.
Yeah, she did, I think it's 19 novels before like going full time into comics.
Yeah. Well, my friend loves her.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about you talked about Image Plus a little bit. It's you said it's a book that's free with previews or its own standalone thing and highlights what's coming out in Image in a more in depth and appealing sort of way. It's expanding to 80 pages in the second season, that starts in September.
That's actually end of this month.
End of this month.
So like last week of August, first week of September.
Oh yeah,
is when we're on shelves.
So
but yeah, I'm stoked.
Yeah. So it's expanding. So I'm curious. What made that originally a fit for what Image does, and beyond that, why? I'm curious about two things: the season model and the expansion. Like, why are you going that route?
Well, it's first started. It was an idea that Corey Murphy, I forget her title. It's super
Director
long.
of Sales and Marketing, I think it is. Director of Sales, at least.
Director of Sales. Yeah, that sounds right. Head honcho, basically. She was like, we need a sales tool. Like one of the most important things in selling comics is making sure that retailers like kind of understand the books and know how to like shift it to customers who might be into it. Mm-hmm. But there's so much noise on comics internet and previews, just in life in general, that can be hard to get the point across.
Right.
So we're like, what if we did a magazine that kind of broke the comics down in that sense? And then we kind of massage that into the shape that it is now, where it's like, if someone called it a catalog, I wouldn't be offended because like I get it.
Right.
But I think it's also like a little bit better than that. It's, I guess, like the catalog from Seinfeld. I don't know. There's an appeal to it beyond just like, oh, what's coming out. And like my whole goal with it is just to do like interesting interviews, interesting features, and to give Sasha Head, our designer, something like really cool to design around. Mm-hmm. Because basically like the Image Plus team is Sasha and I plus a few of our freelancers, like yourself included, Brittany Matter, Henry Barajas, Andrea Towers, who is now at Marvel doing PR,
right,
which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Sam Stone and Vernon Miles, and it's just everyone has different specialties. Everyone's good at different things, so it's sort of like matching a freelancer with a book and then getting something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Mm-hmm. Like Vernon just did an interview with an upcoming creative team, or for a book we haven't announced yet, where it's in character as if the creative team were the press representatives for the Earth organization in the sci-fi comic. And so it's cool to be able to do stuff like that where like it's kind of funny and it makes sense.
Yeah.
I did one with Declan Shalvey that I loved where it was in character as the main guy of his graphic novel Savage Town with Philip Barrett. Mm-hmm. And he wrote it in like deep Irish dialect.
Yeah, he wrote it as Jimmy Savage.
Yeah, and it's great. It is. People were coming up to me at San Diego who were like, "Dude, I didn't know what to expect from this interview, but by the end of it, I was sold." Yeah, and I was like, "That is the exact reaction that we were hoping to get."
I thought, one of the things I thought was really cool was I was reading Walking Dead, and I don't know about you, but I've have an extreme affinity for letters columns, and Walking Dead's one has been around for so long that they're going to have a really interesting one. Also, I'm like obsessed with Andrew J. Shaw, who is like this insane like letter hack. But anyways, then the last message, I think it's in issue 169, was somebody writing about Declan Shalvey's Art Cred article he wrote for Image Plus.
Oh yeah,
yeah, and it was like asking Robert Kirkman and Sean Makowitz what they thought about Art Cred and all this stuff and how important it was. And it was interesting because like the last page of this letters column was all about the Image Plus article, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Wild. Yeah, and that was I've known Declan like a little bit through Twitter and that kind of thing for a while, but we kind of become friends in the past year or so. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about Art Cred and things like that. I was in an Art Cred panel with him at New York Comic Con. That was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. I was like the critic guy.
Yeah.
But I was like, hey, why don't you write a piece for us about Art Cred? And he was like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I want to do it. And then he did it. I think he got help from you on that piece as well, like kind of running ideas past you.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it came out right after someone at another company said something not great about artists.
Yeah.
So it was like a flash fire that kind of took off and was amazing. But it was total serendipity. It was just something that was just in the air.
Yeah, it was definitely an uglier form of serendipity, but it definitely worked out.
But back to the expanding point. So one thing we do with the magazine, we cover like every Image debut and previews that month. Like that's kind of our beat, our remit. But that can be tough. Like we do a 2-page interview and then like 4 pages of preview comics. If we've got 7 or 8 debuts, that's the entire magazine's page count filled up.
Right.
Which is great. Like I feel like it's still good work, but I think that what makes magazines really good are the things that aren't necessarily tied directly to like buy something. Mm-hmm. So an interview with Steve Lieber about storytelling, one with Marjorie Liu, this kind of just generally about the origins of monsters, like that kind of thing. The evergreen stuff is really what kind of makes the engine go for me.
Yeah.
And since we're going to 80 pages from 64, we have more space to do things like that. We've got like a cool image memorabilia spread we've been cooking up for like a couple months. Like we went to Jim Valentino's house and got a bunch of really cool stuff we're going to try to spotlight. And we wouldn't have had space for that necessarily at 64, but we kind of do at 80. But we're also adding more comics to the list, so it kind of almost balances out. We come out ahead in the end
Yeah.
in terms of prose. But we've got the new Scott Snyder and Jock's Witches. Bad Egg starts the end of this month. Ed Pisker's doing the inside front cover strip for us. We've got a new Donny Cates and Ian Biederman comic, a Tomahawk, starting in issue number 2. So we're serializing more comics, which I think is another really important thing to have in like a comics magazine.
Yeah, that is really cool. I remember that. I like that you're doing that because I remember I interviewed oddly. I don't even. It was so random, but I did this survey of parents for this all ages week feature I did at Multiversity Comics, and one of the people who took the survey was Jake Wyatt.
Oh yeah, I love that guy.
Yeah, yeah, and so he actually commented about how one of the things that he really thinks would help with young people reading comics was a Shonen Jump type thing in American comics. And I do like that you're serializing comics in that. Not that it's meant to be like Shonen Jump or something, but I do think that that's a good way for people to, I don't know, especially in creator-owned, be introduced to the work that like Donnie's doing or like Jock or whomever. Not that people don't know who Jock is, but it's a nice gateway.
And I think that it's like from a purely capitalist perspective, like it keeps people coming back, which is good.
Yes.
But from a comics fan perspective, it also gives you a taste of something different. As a kid, like I liked the comics that I liked. I didn't know the other stuff that I might like because I was never exposed to it. Like I would have definitely, like my first DC comic was like The Death of Superman. Like that's when I got into DC books. I would have definitely been into like The Question or something cool like that if I'd known about it. Yeah. So it's just kind of, if you build it and put it in front of people, then they will come.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the grab bag I was talking about earlier.
Oh, totally, yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that everybody, like, the grab bag is the future of comics, but I do think those things had value because I'm trying to remember, I mean, I would never have read the Transformers comics if it weren't for that. Actually, I probably wouldn't have even read comics without those, but I wonder how many people got introduced to comics that they really loved because of those things.
Yeah, and especially as a kid, when you only have, like, so many comics that you read them all, like, a lot.
Right.
Like, there are several villains who I grew up to find were either, like, heroes in disguise or, like, not important at all, who have, like, an outsized place in my psyche, in my memory.
Yeah. I feel like people that are between the age of 30 to 35 have read way more issues of the NAM than they probably would have otherwise because of those grab bags. They always had the NAM in there.
It was that and Silver Surfer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So last question before I have 5 questions about David Brothers, the person. I wanted to ask a little bit about comic sites. Comics Alliance closed earlier this year. That definitely leaves a void in the world of writing about comics. Not that there isn't plenty of great places. But I mean, the internet's in a weird place. It's hard to monetize things. It's hard to write about one subject because everybody's writing about every subject. What do you think of the state of things in that world? And beyond that, like, how difficult of a future do you believe it has with the way that the internet is?
I think the future doesn't look great.
Right.
Like one site went to top 16 lists instead of top 10, and I'm like, oh, that's not a good sign. The shift toward video. Pretty much, if you look at the shape of journalism on the internet in general, even though comics journalism is its own weird thing, like I don't know how everyone's not just screaming all the time.
Yeah.
There was some site, like another site that closed that I liked a lot. MTV News closed recently. A bunch of like corporate backed sites have shut down. So it's kind of like, what hope do comic sites have?
Right.
But my hope, my prayer is that kind of we go back to like the smaller blog site model if the bigger sites can't give us what we need.
Yeah.
Like I really enjoy Women Write About Comics.com. The Comics Mint on Patreon is really good. I read that every month. Zainab Akhtar, of course, Comics and Cola is really good. But I don't find myself going to comic sites on purpose that much anymore, where I used to just wake up and open, like CBR, Newsarama, Comics Alliance, what's going on today.
Right. I do think that to a certain degree, like you look at retail and the things that are doing well are like Amazon, online retailers, or like more small boutique personalized experiences in like local stores. Like those are like the two levels that are seemingly doing really well. It's like the kind of big box stores, like your Payless Shoe Source, or your like I don't know, like the kind of mid level ones. Even like to a certain degree, like Walmarts and Targets and things like that aren't doing as well as they used to because Amazon kind of eats their lunch. I kind of wonder if like you're right with the you're gonna have like I've written for the Ringer, which is a bigger site. Like you're gonna have those guys, and you're gonna have like your AV clubs and your IGNs and things like that. But then at the lower end of the spectrum, you're going to have more like Comics Mint. That's a really interesting model, all Patreon based, or Critical Chips. You know what Zainab's doing, and I think that stuff is really interesting, and I like seeing how people are expanding into different directions and trying to experiment with what's possible.
Yeah, and I love it. I mean, I wrote about comics for 10 years on my own site, and then I kept talking about comics on Twitter for years after that.
Yeah.
So like that conversation is really important to me, and it's not one that, like, the comic shop conversation is different, the bookstore conversation is different, but kind of talking about dumb comics on the internet with your friends is something I don't want to go away.
Right.
And I think that was a big part of the feel of Comics Alliance, of when Fangirls Attack, a lot of sites, like back from when I was getting started, Fanboy Rampage especially, is just like, look at this ridiculous thing that's happening either in the comics industry or in this issue of a comic book.
Right.
And like the big sites can't monetize that, and I just don't want that to get lost by the wayside, because everything that impresses me about comics now are like weird storytelling things or like noodly craft bits.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you're right. It's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. But all right, we're going to close with 5 questions about David Brothers, the person. I want to talk. Anytime somebody is a basketball fan, I have to talk to them about basketball. I'm going to ask the favorite player question, but slightly modified. If you had to pick a favorite player that wasn't a star, who would it be, and what was it about them that made you love them so much?
Ooh. How are you defining star?
So I would say if they were an all-star at some point, like technically, I guess Damian Lillard would count because he. Okay. I mean, I bet a little. Maybe we wouldn't count like somebody like Damian Lillard because he's definitely should be an all-star, but the West is loaded. So, you know, not that level. Not somebody that you would describe as like by name and everybody would know who it was.
Okay, I'll give you 2 just in case one doesn't count.
Sure.
The first is Spud Webb from the Hawks in the 80s.
Yes.
Because I was short as a kid. Like, I didn't hit my growth spurt till I was almost finished with high school. It sucked. So, like, as a short, skinny dude, the fact that this guy could dunk, and not only dunk, but, like, win, like, awards doing it.
Win the dunk contest.
Yeah, like, that was... And, you know, I grew up in Georgia, so, like, the Hawks have always been very near and dear to me. And, weirdly, the Lakers for the same reason, because of that crazy rivalry. So he was definitely one guy. Like, I've had a real affection for him forever, and he can still dunk. Like, nowadays, there's videos on YouTube of him dunking in suits, you know, 30 years later.
That's awesome.
But if not him, then Stephon Marbury.
Yes. Because
there was a point when he put a lot of his money towards making affordable tennis shoes. Like, they were $7 a pair for, you know, adult kids, men, women, whatever. And I thought that was such a cool thing for a guy who grew up poor and then got extremely rich to do. And so he's always kind of been in my heart that way, too.
Didn't he say, I'm trying to remember, somebody asked him why he didn't charge that much for him. And I think it was basically, I mean, he straight up said it was just like, because I couldn't afford shoes like this when I was a kid and I want somebody else to. And yeah. I think that's pretty awesome. I think it's kind of, it's a bummer how he has kind of, he's not as well loved as he used to be, partially by his own thing. But I mean, like, it's kind of amazing how well he's done in China.
Yeah, they made a movie about him in China where he plays himself.
And they made him a citizen, which is not easy to do for Americans because they love him so much.
Like, I can't believe that in China it's Kobe and then Steph Curry and then Stephon Marbury.
Yeah.
That's wild to me. But I love it. Like, I wish that guy all the best.
Yeah, he's pretty awesome. I loved watching him. All right, next question. Image is based out of Portland now, which means you semi-recently had to move. So far, what's your favorite part of your new home, and what's your least favorite?
My least favorite are all the ants. Like, I've got a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, and like ants will just come in and just like look around and then leave. They're not even like, my place isn't a mess. I don't have like crumbs everywhere.
Right.
They just like investigate. I had a horrible thing. This is gonna make no one come over to my house ever again. But I put out ant traps. So there's a crazy heat wave this week. So already like the bugs are going crazy. But I put out ant traps because like the ants have been flaring up, and when I'm out, I put it out in the morning, and I come home, and it's so clogged with ants that they can't get out of the trap and
Oh
take
my
the poison
God.
back to their thing. And I'm just like, this something has to give. And I think that day, like there was an ant apocalypse. 409 kills ants on contact, so I like killed and cleaned simultaneously, and figured out where they came in and all that nonsense. Hands down, my least favorite because it's always a surprise and always like extremely unpleasant.
Hmm.
The best thing, the summer's pretty cool.
Hmm.
But like it's really warm, which I appreciate, and I've got a car now for the first time in 10 years, which makes getting around really easy.
Hmm.
So I spend a lot of time reading outside. Like I have a little beach chair and like a mesh metal coffee table that I keep outside where I'll just sit back with a book and like a cup of tea or something.
Yeah, and there's some nice parks.
Yeah, I've gone on a lot of hikes. I'm the one person in comics that doesn't drink coffee.
Oh man.
Yeah, and everyone's always astounded, but like I love chai lattes. Like that's my thing because of the cinnamon and sugar probably.
Hmm.
So every morning or every evening, whenever I can catch like a sunset or sunrise, I'll just sit outside and absorb it that way.
You might be the one person in Portland who doesn't drink coffee.
Yeah.
Also,
I
that
also don't drink alcohol, so like this craft beer, craft coffee, cold brew culture is like completely foreign to me.
I do have to admit the Portland obsession with beer actually kind of turned me away from beer because they got really into sour beers, and I think sour beers are disgusting. And I went down
Yeah.
there, and I was just like, I don't want sour beer. And after that, it's weird. I don't drink beer anymore. It's like it's not because of sour beer, but it was like, what are you people doing to beer? Stop ruining it.
Yeah. It wasn't because of it, but it helped.
Yeah, it was kind of like the preacher of the reason why I stopped reading comics for a while. All right, so next question. I have to ask about your panel every year at Emerald City Comic Con called Parker Brothers, where you and Jeff Parker chat. It's the greatest title for any panel ever. Who came up with that? Whose idea?
I don't remember if it was me or Parker because we both have the same we both like dad jokes and bad puns.
Yeah.
And I don't remember why we started talking online, but like we get along really well because I think we have like the South in common and like the handyman thing in common, and then like bad jokes.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna say both of us came up with it.
That makes sense.
And it's definitely a Twitter joke gone far, far too long. It's like a 4 or 5 year tradition at this point.
Hmm.
But this year we packed the house at Emerald City.
That's awesome.
But it went from a panel that was kind of like us and people we know from the internet, from Twitter, to standing room only with strangers in the crowd.
That's amazing.
And all it is it's almost like live Twitter where we just like get on stage and talk about comic books.
Hmm.
We had Colleen Coover, Gabriel Hardman, and Corinna Becco this year, so it was like a really fun, like multifaceted conversation. We're doing it again at Rose City Comic Con in September with
Oh.
Steve Lieber and Leila Del Duca.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I actually I was the jerk person who went. I dressed up as J. Jonah Jameson like in 2016 at Emerald City, and I never cosplayed before. I just wanted to try the experience, and I actually yelled Parker at him, and he was I feel like he was like 12% mad because that happens all the time, and I was just like, oh man, I ruined this. This is terrible. However, Steve Lieber loved it, took a picture of me, and also I made a fake newspaper called Sketch Daily from my previous site, and
Yeah.
Steve did a drawing of the Shocker in it, which was really awesome. It's like this random
That's awesome.
keepsake that I love. But anyways, I love the Parker Brothers title. It's so great.
Yeah, at one point they're gonna have to notice and be like, "What's going on here exactly?" But so far so good.
So next question. This is a cruel question to ask you. I apologize, but in another life, you mentioned before you worked in the field of video games. There's been a Twitter thing that's been going around where people are saying the 5 favorite video games. They've been quote tweeting it and sharing their 5 favorite video games. If you had to pick 5, just the first 5 that you think of, what would they be? What are your 5 favorite video games?
Final Fantasy Tactics,
Okay,
Metal Gear 1.
like the NES one.
Oh no, Metal Gear Solid 1,
Oh, okay.
PlayStation 1. I would say Tekken 3. That's 3 so far, right? Mark of the Wolves
Mm-hmm.
and NBA 2K in general.
That's awesome. That is a very interesting mix.
Yeah, they're the games that either have the most like personal resonance or that I put hundreds of thousands of hours into over my time. Like I beat Final Fantasy Tactics in the 90s and I've just been kind of like off and on playing it ever since.
That's awesome.
Like across several systems. Like I have it on PSP right now. I had it emulated for a while. I almost bought the iPad version, but I guess it's buggy and doesn't work anymore.
Oh, that
So,
sucks.
but yeah, no, those are all games. Like Tekken 3, there was like a whole story behind that. NBA 2K, it's my favorite game every year. I mean, I love basketball pretty
Hmm.
much, and it just gets better and better. Though they got beat to getting the WNBA by NBA Live, which is not the good basketball game.
Right. Yeah, I
But I've been
saw that.
praying for that for years. I feel like it'd be so cool just to get those teams into the game because I love like NBA, WNBA. It's all fun to me.
You know what's really weird? I'm a huge basketball fan, but I've never really liked basketball games. I don't know what it is about it. I just feel like it's so much. Maybe it's because like the complexity makes it to me feels a little bit more rigid and less flow. Because like my favorite part about basketball largely is passing. Like I love
Oh yeah,
like Steve Nash, like Steph Curry is an amazing passer. Actually, he gets very underrated in that regard. Like LeBron has like the best vision ever.
LeBron's ridiculous.
Yeah, but I mean, like I feel like I never can get the proper flow, and I think it's a personal problem because I'm just not good enough at those games. But
Are you
I
playing with friends or alone?
alone.
Play with friends. That's what got me. It basically turned into like a Skype with a friend while we were also competing in basketball.
Hmm.
And so they can kind of talk you through something if you don't understand it yet, but then also it's like a lower pressure way to play.
Hmm.
Because you're playing alone, you're like, oh, I've got to beat this. But if you're with your friend, like the time spent is still worthwhile.
Yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
that's what changed it for me. Like when I got NBA 2K11 was where I picked up basketball games again, and it was all because a friend was playing it. I played it at his house and was like, oh man, like there are so many buttons, but this is so fun.
Yeah, yeah. I got NBA 2K17, and like I played it a bit. I really need. Yeah, maybe I'll get back into it. The problem is like. I have an Xbox, and nobody has Xboxes that I actually know. I made a huge mistake not getting a PS4. But yeah,
Yeah.
for me, like I was into playing the manager modes and stuff, and like I'm an Indiana Pacers fan, so
Okay.
I would do the Paul George trade, but do it right this time.
I've seen Paul George live a couple times. I went to a Drew League game in LA.
Oh,
It's
that's
like
awesome.
a local thing. And it was a game where it was the season before, or I'm sorry, the summer between the season where he came back.
Hmm.
And he did the Vince Carter dunk live, like on a fast break.
Like the
And
arm.
yeah, like through the legs.
Oh man.
Yeah, that one. And I was like, the entire crowd just like sat back. It was such a good moment.
I remember watching. I was watching the game where he did the 360, like we're kind of like a reverse 360 windmill against the Clippers in game, and I was just like, I couldn't believe it. It was like the most jaw dropping thing. It's funny because like a lot of people get really mad when their players leave. I have Paul George basketball shoes because I actually play basketball, and I have like Paul George socks. I have a Paul George shirt that's like it's like the Beatles shirt where it's like Paul George or Ringo, Paul George, and John, and everyone's always like, "Oh, I love the Beatles." I'm like, "It's not a Beatles shirt; it's a Paul George shirt." I still have that, and I'm like, "I don't know what to do with you. I still love you," and I actually like OKC because I love Russell Westbrook, and
Yeah, me too.
I don't know. It's gonna be a fun season to see, but it does make me very sad that he's not on the Pacers anymore.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat where I'm happy when guys leave to get more money.
Right.
Like Tim Hardaway Jr. had a fantastic year with the Hawks. I would love it if like he'd retired with the Hawks, but
He
New
got
York gave him like
paid.
$70 million.
Yeah.
Like well done.
Was it four
Uh,
years, 71 or something?
yeah, it was wild. Like I can't even imagine that much money.
His dad is mad at him how much he made.
But like Kyle Korver was a Hawk for a long time. I was a huge fan of him. And like if the Cavs had won the finals, which I'm glad they didn't because I'm a Warriors fan as well, I would have been like, oh, I'm glad that Kyle got a ring. You know.
Yeah.
But Zaza Pachulia got another ring, and he was also a former Hawk, and he's from the other Georgia, so like that's also cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Oh man, Zaza, such a love-hate guy. Ugh.
Yeah.
I like him except for when he's playing against my team. Then I'm like, please don't kill any of my players.
Yeah. Don't Frankenstein it up.
Very perfect. All right, so last question. We've addressed this. You're a big manga fan. Let's say one of my listeners wanted to get into the world of manga and wasn't sure where to start because that's a very legitimate thing. What's the one series that you tell them to dive into?
Everyone always says like Akira or something like that, but I feel like that's an investment.
Right.
I would say if they like murder mysteries or just like kind of like Law and Ordery stuff, try Pluto, which is by Naoki Urasawa. It's about essentially the 8 strongest robots in the world are being killed, but it's told like a straight up procedural. Like it focuses on a German detective who's also a robot. If they like sports or if they're open to like competition and that kind of thing, Takahiko Inoue's Real is extremely good. like it's theoretically about wheelchair basketball, but it's just about kind of overcoming situations that you're put into. Like big sections of it take place at rehab. Like there's a lot of stuff about like an absentee father coming back to try to help his son who was injured in a car accident. It's extremely emotional. Like I love it. There's even like a wrestling volume where a wrestler gets back in the ring after like a grievous injury. But it's so human and down to earth that I think if you're open to manga and that kind of like emotional storytelling, you'll have a really good time.
It's funny.
But if you-
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was trying to think of a good one for like action fans, but say what you were saying, and then I'll come back.
I
to
was just
it.
gonna say I actually have Real, and I have yet to read it, so now I have additional reason to read it.
Yeah, it will devastate you.
Great,
Like-
I'm excited.
There's one part where the father, he's feeling bad that he wasn't there for his son, but he's like, that time apart wasn't wasted because I'm still here for you now, and I'm just bawling, and it's just way too much.
That's awesome.
Man, I can't think of a good action one because all the action ones I like are extremely like long running.
You're not gonna recommend Berserk to anybody?
Berserk, it's one of those ones where it gets too intense.
Don't let Sebastian Gerner hear that. I don't know if you know, but he is like the world's biggest fan. He actually sent me the first 2 volumes, and that is one of the tricky things about manga is like sometimes those books are long, like the runs are so long. Like you're saying, was it One Piece that's 85 volumes?
Yeah, which is absurd.
Yeah, it's hard. Like that's kind of a tough one to give somebody. You're like, oh, try this out. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of volumes. I kind of feel like a good one to like hand somebody as a standalone is Master Keaton. And just because they're so like there's a lot to them, and they kind of stand on their own. They're very episodic in a way that a lot of Urasawa stuff isn't necessarily. And it's very enjoyable. I actually think that's a really good comic.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like fundamentally, what if Indiana Jones was a big nerd? Like it's just so good on that level.
Yeah. Anyways, David, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting comics with me.
No, thank you. This was a great time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Image's branding manager, David Brothers. You can find him on Twitter at Hermanos, on his website at IamDavidBrothers.com, and his work in Image Plus magazine. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Phil Null, Ian Maxfield, Benjamin Schipper, Barry Straw, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Dan Lee, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mayle, Adam Highfill, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morse, Johan Borander, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Matt Battaglia, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DeMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. Quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.